Matter. It's her fourth book. It's Nancy Kricorian. Nancy, how are you doing?
Um, Let us
Be
say,
honest. Be honest. How are you
I'm
doing?
going to say, horsemen of the apocalypse and global conflagration aside, I personally am maintaining my equilibrium. So
This is
what
one of the
else?
challenges of being a human. Is there's the I remember. Okay, I'll tell a quick story. Listeners,
Yes.
it's not about me. This is going to be about Nancy, but this strikes me as my when I waited tables for years trying to make a way as a writer, and I did not have. And
Mm.
I was at it for a long time. My father called me. He's an odd fellow. When I turned 40, and said, "How does it feel to be 40 and still waiting tables?" Ugh. So he asked me this, and the answer was weird. I was like, "It only is painful when I think about it, when I think a certain way about it. Otherwise, I'm just doing my thing." And isn't
Right.
that true of a lot of life? You do your thing, but all this stuff is happening around you. And when you think about it, that's when it's hard. Is that fair?
Yeah. Slightly fair, except for I'm also an organizer and an activist. So when I'm not
Okay.
writing, I
Yeah,
spend
yeah.
my time. My motto is a line from Grace Paley, who was one of my favorite writers, and the line is, "The only recognizable feature of hope is action." So that's
Oh,
how I live my life.
I like it. Okay. And so
Yeah,
you have funneled some of your energy, your creative energy into activism, which I think is always interesting. I think it is a creative energy. Do you agree with that?
yes, I do. I do.
Yeah. All right. We're going to get to that. That's interesting. I
Yeah,
didn't know, but
yeah,
let's get to book number four. Uh,
yes,
this is the first book of yours I've read.
yes,
I love the way you do it. I love the way you handle the material. You've got an unusual approach. We can get into it some, but I think
yeah.
it's really effective and it's different and very poetic, but in the best sense of the word. Maybe there's not a bad sense of the word, but I think in the most compelling sense of the word.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
so let's start. Where did all this writing obsession start? You strike me, Nancy, as someone who's a bit bookish as a girl. I was a bit bookish as a boy. Is
Exactly.
that fair?
Exactly. I started writing poetry when I was in first grade.
Ooh.
My first poems were published by being hanged on the bulletin board
Yeah.
for parent teacher night when I was in
Yeah.
third grade.
Yep.
And when I was in third grade, the teacher called my mother in and said that my mother should prevent me from reading so much because I was living in a fantasy world of books and not engaging with the other children sufficiently. So my mother would send me out to the backyard to play, and I would hide a book under my jacket and go sit in the bushes and read. But anyway, so yes,
No,
you got
wait. I love teachers. They're under assault these days.
it. Yeah,
And
I
every once in a
know.
while, they say the stupidest things.
Well,
For
I mean,
well-intentioned though it is, but
there was probably some truth in it, but trying to take the books away was not the method to deal with it, I don't think.
no. So you were at it young, and you started
Yeah,
as a reader. It is a thing though with that. It's funny. I always say the average. I've done a lot of these conversations. The average
right.
age writers but there are plenty of exceptions. But it's
Yeah,
around nine. You started even earlier, but there's something that kind of blooms in us at that time where we start wanting to try that. Probably an extension of our pretend life. Our
yeah.
because we all have children that we live in pretend worlds. It seems to translate to it. I don't know why, but that's when it starts happening for a lot of us.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I started writing poems as soon as I started
Yeah.
writing. I don't even
Poems.
know why. Yeah,
Poems, not stories, but
no,
poems.
poems. Yeah.
I'm impressed. All right, so I'm guessing, did you study literature and writing in college? Did you just not
Yeah,
go to college? You strike out like a
no,
hobo
no, no,
on
no,
this.
no.
Oh,
No, no. I come from a sort of working class family. My dad was a meat cutter in a
hmm,
supermarket on
okay.
the other side of Harvard Yard. I lived in Watertown,
Oh,
Massachusetts,
that's
which
so
was
interesting. Both worlds at the same time. That's so interesting. Okay.
well, yeah, I grew up in the Armenian community of East Watertown, Massachusetts, and my
Yep.
mom ran a family daycare in our home. And
Wow.
when I went to college, I wanted to get
Sure.
out of Watertown, out of the Armenian scene, and
Yeah.
I ended up going to Dartmouth, where I was a comp lit major, but I also did a senior fellowship where they give you like an office and
Ah,
you
that's
don't have to take
great.
classes, and you sit in this office in the library. And I wrote a manuscript of poems, but I also finished my comp lit major, and then I went to Paris for a year and studied semiotics with Julia
Oh
Cosera.
my God, you studied semiotics. See, I grew up
I
in Providence, Rhode Island, which was
oh
home
this
to Brown
yes
University, where it was
exactly
just
the
rampant.
epicenter of
Yes,
semiotics. Yeah, but I
yes.
actually went to
You went
you
to the
know
real
the
epicenter.
motherland of
Yes.
semiotics,
Wow.
Paris. And then I came to New York and studied got an MFA in poetry at Columbia, and
Can I just
then yeah,
say, I am
yeah.
so impressed that you studied semiotics and survived to write in a way that was accessible, meaningful, and emotionally relevant. Because I look at this is my own bias against
Okay, okay,
that kind of intense intellectualization of the arts. Uh,
yeah.
but it didn't turn you against writing from the heart, let's say.
Well, no, I mean, I have to tell you the thing that was interesting. I was in Paris at the University of Paris. It was in the Faculty of Science. They had put the
Okay.
semiotics department was in with the biology and chemistry and da da da, and
Yeah.
it was called the Department of the Science of the Study of Texts and Documents.
Okay. Oh, Jesus God. Oh my God. Were
But it
you
was
fluent in French? Were
I
you
I was fluent in French. I
Oh,
was.
I'm so impressed. Okay. God, Armenian girl from East Waterson? What?
Watertown,
Watertown,
Massachusetts. Yes.
Massachusetts. The name is, I probably did visit. I grew up in Providence, like I said. So, it was all
Yeah.
fluid.
Oh, there's an Armenian community there
Oh,
too.
yeah.
When my first novel came out, Zabel, which was a fictionalized account of my grandmother's life as an Armenian genocide survivor and
Hmm.
immigrant bride, um, you know, it did quite well, and the Armenian community came out. The people came out in droves, and I was
Sure.
invited to basically pretty much every Armenian church on the Eastern Seaboard by the
Wow.
Women's Guild. And so I was doing like, covered dish suppers for the combined
Really?
ladies guilds of Philadelphia.
Wow.
And I also was in Providence. So
Let's see. Providence is a small city with all
yeah.
these tiny little communities of different. So even though it's not that big a city. All right.
Yeah.
So
I just
when
want to
did
say this is really funny and fun. This is like the most wide-ranging sort of podcast interview I've done. I'm like,
uh,
I don't know where we're going
I don't
next, but
know either.
I'll follow you.
That's why it's so wide ranging. I don't know what I'm going to talk to you about until you appear before me. You know why that
Okay.
is, Nancy? This is true. I learned this even if I read a memoir. Yours is not
Yeah.
memoir. I've read memoirs where I
Mm.
feel like I learn more about the author the moment either I meet them or they appear on my screen and say hello to me, and I actually see them than I learned
Yeah.
in their whole memoir. Not that the memoir isn't good and meaningful in certain ways, but
Yeah.
as a human being, I don't know you until I meet you, and then that tells me what I want to talk about. Does that make
Oh,
sense?
yeah, it makes sense. It makes
Yeah.
sense. Well, there's a sort of spontaneity to it that's a little scary, a little bit like tightrope walking, but we're going to go for it.
Don't you worry. We can hold our hand. We'll hold hands through
Okay,
this.
okay. And there's a net. I'm sure there's a net.
Yeah, I am the net. I am the net in this. Okay,
Okay.
so all right, so you study semiotics, but the whole time your poet's heart is beating.
Yes.
It wants expression.
Yes.
Did you start with short stories, poems, and literary mags, that kind of thing, before you move on to your first novel?
I started publishing poems in literary, it was all poems in literary magazines. And then after my grandmother died, I started writing interconnected short stories
Hmm.
about a fictionalized character that was based on her. And that became my first novel.
Were you close to her?
Yeah, I grew up in the same house. It was a two-family house where
Okay,
she
so
lived
you were,
upstairs and I was
yeah.
downstairs. Yeah, yeah, very
And her
close.
story, because my wife's grandmother's Jewish and fled the pogroms of Russia, and so they actually got her to, like, they recorded. She told them the story of that.
Yeah.
They did it before she passed away, and it was quite powerful. And it kind of resonated through the family. Um, so okay, so her life, and did she tell you stories about her life?
It was
Some
very
do, some don't. I mean,
Yeah, she really did. She used to tell a lot of stories, like a lot of stories. She was Bible stories,
hmm,
about things that happened when she was a girl in the old country, but fairy tales, So we would go up, my sister and I would go upstairs, my mother would go shopping or whatever and leave us with my grandmother. And she would just, make us macaroni and cheese
right,
for some reason and tell us all these stories. So, but she never talked about what had happened to her
sure,
when in 1915 during the deportation, what she called the massacres and deportations, until I was in college. I was
right,
taking a women's studies class on mothers and daughters in literature, and one of the paper topics was to do an oral history with a woman in your family.
Mm,
So I went and interviewed my grandmother, and she just told me this sort of mind-blowing, horrific story of what had happened to her and her family when they were driven out of the hometown.
yeah.
My grandmother ended up, she and her brother, everybody else in the family died, and she and her brother were like with 8,000 Armenian orphans in the Syrian desert in a
Wow.
camp.
Wow.
And it was interesting because she had never told that story even to her own children or to anyone in the family. And there was a documentation, there was a project um, where they were trying to document Armenian genocide survivors' stories. And so there
Yeah.
was someone in our church who was doing interviews for that. And she kept making appointments with my grandmother, and my grandmother kept canceling them because she didn't want to tell the story. But when it was me and I came, and sat on the back porch with her, she told me this story. And then
Wow.
that story became the seed sort of from which I grew the tree of my first novel.
Listening to you, it occurs to me,
Yeah,
that not telling the story, I think is pretty common.
yeah,
And I think in part, and I'm speaking now as a storyteller
yeah,
who writes memoir stuff, but yours wasn't memoir, but it was in the vicinity of memoir because you were taking a painful story and turning it into art.
yeah,
Is I think sometimes the reason people don't tell stories is they understand on some intuitive level that they don't know how. Because there's certain ways, in other words, you can tell the story in a way that devastates the listener, and you can tell a story in a way that educates, uplifts, but you know the power of story. And
yeah.
how do you tell it so you don't, not really damage, but you don't want to, like, I wouldn't want to, if I was telling my children, I wouldn't want to devastate my children. If I'm going to tell them about the tough things in my life, I want to do it in a way that has some perspective, that leaves
Mm.
them with, that doesn't frame the world as an unfriendly place, ultimately. Does
Right. I mean,
that
I
make
think,
sense?
yeah, it does make sense. But I think that I know people who had Armenian grandparents of the same generation who talked incessantly about what had
Ah,
happened. And
yeah,
then they were like, I don't want to hear it. Why are you telling that story
right,
again?
right,
And I think for my grandmother and her friends, I feel like they probably talked about it amongst
right,
each other,
right.
between themselves. But I think there was a certain sense of just wanting to, I don't think there was the same culture of talking about those experiences that
Yeah, yeah,
developed. It started in the 70s, I think, where there was, you came to America and you were supposed to adapt and you were supposed to
right,
assimilate and you were
right,
supposed to go on and have your American life. And
right,
I think that there wasn't really a culture of that these stories were brought forward. And in a weird way, I felt like almost that she was waiting, maybe even waiting for somebody to ask her.
right. Oh, yeah. Well, everybody deals with it differently. Yeah, that's so
Yeah,
interesting. So, all right. So this is your first novel, but you've been writing a lot of poetry, um,
yeah,
different form, obviously.
yeah, yeah.
Did you like the form? Once you started doing it, did you understand the value of it for you as a writer?
For the fiction, you mean, moving
Yeah,
to
when
the
you started your,
novel?
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it was very overwhelming because I had been writing poetry, like I said, since I was 6 or 7. And I did poetry as an undergrad, creative writing as an undergraduate, doing poetry. And then I went and got an MFA in poetry at Columbia. And so it was like really, I was used to doing things that were 1 to 2 to 3 pages maximum.
yeah,
And all of a sudden I was like, how are you possibly going to
yeah,
do this? And I thought the way that I did it in my head was like, you just have to write like 20 10-page chapters.
right, right,
So
yeah.
I could only think of it in these 10-page units, which was sort of still expanding from what I had been used to doing. But I felt like, oh, I can do that.
See, boy, that was so smart because I was listening to some person who gives advice recently,
Yeah,
they said something which is really true, which is if you're overwhelmed, break it down into the smallest steps. And if those steps are too small, make it smaller steps still,
right,
And I was telling one of my clients, I was like, look at man, write it one sentence at a time. Just finish this sentence.
right,
And because in some truth, you never know what the next sentence is until you actually finish this one.
right,
Right. And so
right.
you did a very wise thing right out of the gate with yourself.
Well, the other thing, and because I have taught creative writing off and on, since I was a grad student at
Right.
Columbia, was the first time I started teaching, I was teaching composition, and then I moved on to
Right.
as an adjunct teaching creative writing. And and I still mentor young writers, although not through a university setting, but through other programs.
Right.
And the thing I say is just write 15 minutes a day. You
Yeah.
just have to sit down and write
Yeah.
15 minutes a day. If you promise yourself you're going to do 15 minutes, that's all you have to do. But once you sit down, it might become an hour.
That's right. Oh, see, I'm impressed because my mom wanted to write novels. She may be
Yeah,
listening to this. Hi, mom. And she did. She wrote a bunch of them, but she was having trouble even though she was retired. And my first
yeah,
advice to her was one a flute teacher had given me when I wasn't practicing. He said, "You're
right.
only allowed to practice 30 minutes a day." And I was like, and suddenly it became easier. So I said to
Oh,
her, "You're
oh,
only allowed to write 30 minutes a day."
all right.
And then it would
Yeah.
become an hour or two often. But I think 15 minutes, even less. And I think it's really true. Because, actually, it was Andre Dubus when I was talking to him about that. He said, I've gotten a good 15 minutes in sometimes. Sometimes just a good 15 minutes, you get an
Well,
idea, you get a something down. It's okay.
right. Well, the other thing about that is it's just the regularity of the practice and the regularity of paying attention to the project.
Yeah.
Because even if you only have 15 minutes, because I wrote my books while I had my kids were growing up, I had two dogs, I had like all this activist organizing work I was
Yeah.
doing. And I just thought, if you just do 15 minutes, or at one point it was just do one page,
Yeah.
it keeps it in the front of your mind so
That's
that as
right.
you're out walking the dog, you're still working on it.
Absolutely. And if you don't, I tell my clients, I'm like, if you put it away for a week, it's okay, but it will take you that much longer every time you come back to it to sort of get the engine started again because you forget.
Yeah,
You forget what
yeah,
it is.
yeah,
So as I mentioned, so it's interesting. I knew you wrote poetry, but I didn't understand what a poet you had been as a starting where you had for how you
yeah,
started. And it makes sense because you take in terms of structure to the burning heart of the world, there
yes.
is a sort of brevity that you use that is so effective. And I was really admiring it right out of the gate. And I thought, I love what she's doing here because you was really saying how, because every chapter is its own little scene for the most, I mean, sometimes
Right.
mostly a scene. And it was like, how much can I get done in the least amount of space? I don't know if that was your goal, but I felt like that
Yeah,
we're going to see what we can do because each chapter, bang, 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 they're short. I mean, 2 or 3 pages, probably 700 words less sometimes, right?
yeah, yeah.
And it was like a great experiment in, well, just how the most with the least. So the poet's need for economy, I felt was coming to the fore. Is that a fair?
Yeah, that is fair. That was one of the things, yes, that I was trying to do. I mean, I will say I do exhaustive research. So the first draft of this novel was sort of bristling with facts.
Oh, how
And
nice.
I I knew everything about all the different, because it's set in Beirut, a lot of it during the Lebanese Civil War. So I knew everything about all the different militias and what their flags were and
Right.
insignias and who was allied with whom at what point and when their alliances shifted. And like I had all this like, oh, all this like too much, and so that was all in the first draft. And then I thought, okay, this section of the book, because there are 4 sections, and the longest section is in Beirut between 1970 and 75. I mean, 75 and 80, from the point of view of a 15 to 15-year-old girl. And I thought, okay, my character's Vera. What is she going to know? What does she know? She doesn't know everything that I know from having read 60 books about the Lebanese Civil War. But
Wow.
I have this, in all 4 of the books, I really just have this intense commitment to historical accuracy. That's one thing. And the other thing is I want it to be an immersive experience where you open the page, you are immediately in the place and the
Right.
time that I'm writing about. And you should be able to, and for people who lived it, they should be able to recognize
Yeah.
it.
You know, and this I have so much I so admire people because I mean, did you ever visit Beirut?
I went to Beirut 3 times
Okay, because
and
it
I
helps because
interviewed.
it God, you need to just like smell it, touch it, be. I mean, how
Hear
otherwise
it.
it's
I
all
mean, it's
just
somebody even asked me because somebody who was there who was saying, how did you, because I grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts,
right,
in the
right,
Armenian community. I was not in Beirut. I knew
right.
people who came from there, but they said, how did you know what it sounded like? And I said, well, this is a crazy thing, which you couldn't do before, but I can put in like the name of a weapon into YouTube and find
Oh,
sound.
anything,
Anything. And the
anything.
father in the novel is a lathe operator who, at one point, it didn't end up in the book, but he was a lathe operator who turned spoons, made spoons. So I was watching on YouTube people turning spoons,
Right.
so that I could describe it accurately.
Man,
And yeah,
how
and the
did they
other,
do it? How did they do it in the dark ages before the
I
internet?
don't know. Well, because then the Dark Ages, my last book, which came out in 2013, has a father who's a cobbler. And so this was kind of crazy. I ordered a pair of shoes made because they wouldn't let me come and watch them unless they were making the shoes for me, so that I could go into and watch them make the shoe from start to finish.
Wow. Different times.
I know.
Different
Now
times.
I wouldn't have to do that. You could just find it on YouTube.
Sure. Well, it was very effective, and I don't, I've made a lot of the form, but that's the thing that really got my. I mean, so I should say, so it takes place partly around in New York City, also, and then.
Yeah, well, let me describe it.
Sure, thank you.
There
You'll
are
do a better job than
there are
me.
four sections. There's a very brief prologue, which is set in 1973 when Vera, our character, is probably 8 years old, and she and her parents go into her brothers go into the mountains to visit some relatives in the country, but they're from Beirut. So there's a very brief prologue. And then you go back and you go forward in time to 9/11. Vera is now an adult with two kindergarten children, and it's the 9/11 attacks happen in New York City. And you see her response to what's going on. And what the 9/11 attacks has done is sort of opened up the old trauma of having lived through the Lebanese Civil War as a child. So we're watching Vera in her, New York life, her American life, but all of a sudden, all the ghosts from the Lebanese Civil War are coming back, and she's coming undone.
Right.
And so she's coming undone, and then there's a moment where then it goes back in time to 1975 Beirut, and we see Vera as being from 10 to 15-year-old girl growing up in Beirut during the Lebanese Civil War. And then the very last section is a very short section. Again, it's a fairy tale. I think it's like 9 pages or something. It's a folk tale that's set in the Armenian town that Vera's grandmother had grown up in. And it's set during the genocide.
Right. And
So,
so,
so
yeah.
yeah.
So
So
but this covers a lot of ground, but in a tight package, and so it really well done. This is the thing. I always read with two minds: my writer's mind and just my reader's mind.
right. Yeah.
And when I'm going to interview, it tends to be more my writer's mind, sadly. But I so liked what you were doing. And I've become I'm a greater and greater fan of economy just out of curiosity of like what can get done. And
Yeah.
so, was it your goal to try to tell it that way, or is that just how it happened? Or did you say,
You mean to
well, in other words, you said, okay, I think my approach, because I don't know if my approach, I'm going to try and do it in short chapters and not just the 4 parts, but the small chapters, small scenes, or
yeah.
did you just, that's the way it evolved?
Um, I think that's just the way I think that's just the way that it evolved. And
Yeah.
then I really was able to, I don't know why. I mean, this is the shortest of the novels that I've done.
Yeah.
It's only, what is it, 186 pages or something. And my other books have been more in the 250 to
Right. Sort of
275
standards.
range.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But there was just something where there was something, the word that kept coming is like, I want this to be adamantine,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
you know, like that, sharp, that
Yeah.
hard, but not
Yeah.
hard but I just mean that, taut somehow,
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
And so that's what I was going for. And I was hoping, I mean, because it's not the narrative structure where you're going sort of back and forth in time. And there's a way, it's not like a detective novel or something, but there's
Yeah.
a way that you don't understand all of the things that you've seen
Yep.
until you get to that folktale in the end,
Yeah.
and then I hope it ties it all
Well, there
together.
is actually, I mean, it has a mystery element to it in that way, not in the
Yes.
detective sense, but there is like what is going like. But that's true of I think a lot of stories. You have to have an element of why why are they behaving this? What is the real thing happening behind all this? That
Yes.
right. We
Yeah.
and you can't usually don't just show it up front. So
Yeah.
very good. Very good. Well, okay, so this came out a week ago, about,
Yes.
and
Yes.
the day before Liberation Day. And so, um, so aside from this, have you had a few conversations about it with have you had a few events or done
Y-
anything?
Yeah, well, there are 600,000 or so Armenians in LA.
Nice.
So I started my book tour in LA. The publisher is ready.
Glendale.
I've
Glendale.
got
I lived in
Glendale.
Glendale, and there's a huge Armenian population
Okay,
there,
let me
right?
tell you, I was like, I did an event at Diesel Books in Brentwood. I did an event at Oxy Arts that was a panel discussion with some other Armenian artists that I'm friends with out there. Then I did Glendale Central Library.
Nice.
And then I did an event at the Red Hen Press, which is my publisher, did a literary salon for
Where
me
are
in
they?
Pasadena.
They're in Pasadena. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. Oh,
So
wow.
it was,
Four events in LA.
well, even more because I showed up the week before to go to the Associated Writing Programs
Oh, you
convention.
were there. How was
I
it?
would, I've never been there before. I had never,
I've been. It came to Seattle once, and I did a reading with some people,
yeah,
but I didn't actually go to the thing.
yeah. I mean, I feel so bad. I know this is really terrible to say this, but it felt to me like a dental convention with books. Do you know what
Uh,
I mean?
well, yeah, that
Do you know
doesn't
what I mean?
surprise me. It's
It's
so
like it's
big.
all it's huge. There's 10,000 people there. There's 10,000 people
Oh,
and everybody's, it's a lot about networking and do you know what I mean? People are pitching their
yes.
books and people are talking, there's a lot of but there were some, I went to a couple of panels that were really good, and I did three offsite events in the evenings where they had, a number of writers reading
Right. That's what I
together.
did. Yeah.
And I did those. I did three offsite events. So it was, I totally get it. Why people
I've
do
never
it.
been,
Yeah.
although I've always been a little. I look at to my brothers and sisters in the writing programs across the country. I'm sure AWP is great, but I always kind of prefer writers' conferences, traditional, where it's the students and teacher, because I just feel it's a different vibe to it, a more
Yeah.
instructional vibe. This is networking, but not on a different kind of
Yeah.
level,
Well,
you know?
it feels, I mean, I think the reason, I mean, I don't mean to, I think dental conventions are fine. I think any kind, you
Right.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like any kind of convention is fine. But there's something very corporate and industrial about it,
Right. Now, then it's when it gets that big, I don't know how it doesn't become that in a way.
Yeah.
You know,
I
it's a lot
mean,
of
there were
money.
still a lot of lovely moments and sweet. I sat at the Red Hen booth signing copies of my
Yeah.
book, which was
Yeah.
very sweet. And,
Sure.
there were nice moments, but it was, I don't really love being in those huge spaces with 10,000 people.
Yeah, I understand. Well, this is good. And so you've got your sort of built-in, well, not built-in, but you've got your nucleus audience of Armenians, but and then of course just the people who like to read good stories too. So that's at
Yeah.
least you
Yeah.
know where
And
to start promotion wise, right?
yes, exactly. Well, you know what I say, because people are like, oh, you don't write just for Armenians. And I'm like, no, I don't just write for Armenians, but you know, selling literary fiction is really hard,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And some people came, Armenians, like I'm a minor celebrity in the Armenian community, and people came and bought 10 copies of the book and had me
Wow.
inscribe them to every person in
Yeah.
their family kind of thing. So
No, you gotta you
I'm those are my people. I'm
no.
writing for them, and and as I said, I've done other podcast interviews. Other. It's not restricted to that, but I always think. I mean, I carry it around with me. I always think of Toni Morrison.
Uh-huh.
Her line, I'm writing for Black people in the same way that Tolstoy was not writing for me, a 14-year-old colored girl from Lorain,
Right,
Ohio.
right. But just because you have them in mind doesn't mean but you always but you're really writing for humans at the end of the day. And so
Yes.
but you're just humans who are you're describing Armenian humans. And so if you really write about humans ultimately, then it's for everybody.
Right. That's what she said. Nobody complained Tolstoy was writing for Russians.
Right. It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. Of course. Well, I write memoir, and I guarantee you, I don't expect everyone to look like me. So I try to think that people would read my things and feel like it's about them. That would
Yeah,
always be.
yeah.
All right. Well, Nancy, okay. Again, The Burning Heart of the World. Beautiful book. Pick it up. Great airplane read. Hey, why not, man? It would be a good airplane read. You could enjoy it and become immersed in it. And if you had a cross-country flight, you might be done with it by the time you get to the other end of the flight.
That is actually true.
Yeah.
That
So
is
no,
true.
no, it's
Well,
not a bad thing at all. Okay, I got one more question for you.
okay.
One more
Okay.
question. I want you to think about all the writing you've done, even your
Yes.
semiotic nonsense.
Yes.
I'm sure it was very formative. Even the semiotics, but all the writing you've done, poetry,
Yes.
fiction, yeah. And if it's taught you anything about being human, about life, it's taught you what?
I guess I don't know. I love Armenian proverbs, and the one that just popped into my head was, "The world is wide. What use is it if my heart is narrow?"
Ah, you know what?
So
Yeah,
that's what I feel like in my writing, that it's about opening your heart to people, to other people's experiences and other people's suffering. And I mean, that's what the character's about in the book. She's always feeling everybody's suffering. And my goal as a writer is to amplify the humane in the human, because there's a lot of stuff in the human that's very violent and awful.
sure.
But what I'm interested in is the humane.